Welcome to the Bogosity podcast for June 6, 2011, the podcast that never takes the obvious for granted. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's inspect with diligence the news of the bogus. Eddie Sales keeps the crepe myrtles nicely pruned at Albemarle Road Presbyterian Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. But despite the fact that they've been doing this for many years, the city of Charlotte gave them a citation and charged them with thousands of dollars in fines just for pruning their trees. Tom Johnson, senior urban forester for the City of Charlotte Land Development Division, said, "When they are non-repairable, when they have been pruned beyond repair, we will ask them to be replaced." But what does that mean, beyond repair? If the tree is still alive and growing, what is there to repair? And since when is it the government's business what private parties do with the trees on their own property? He said that anyone who wants to trim their trees should get a permit. And then a government stooge from the Land Development Division will give them instructions on what they should do. What? To trim your own trees on your own property? The State Division of Forestry even said that people trimming trees should be certified by the National Horticulture Board. They said it's not a requirement, but what do they think they're even doing here? And get this, they're fining the church $100 per branch, which means that the total fine comes to $4,000. They told the church they could avoid the fine if they replaced the trees by October, but Sales doesn't know how much it would cost to do so. Isn't it up to the church and its members to decide how their own property is to be landscaped? Johnson also said, "The purpose of the tree ordinance is to protect trees. Charlotte has always been known as the city of trees." Yeah, you know what else Charlotte is known for? How about high crime rates? On the crime index, where 100 is safest, Charlotte rates a 2. That means that it has more crime than in 98% of U.S. cities. Nationally, your chance of being a victim of a violent crime is 4.7 out of 1,000. In Charlotte, it's 13.43. And there are over 18 times as many crimes per square mile in Charlotte than there is throughout North Carolina. Charlotte is also known as the city of bad traffic. One study calculated greater traffic delays in Charlotte than in any city in the United States except Los Angeles. With all of these problems and more, why is Charlotte wasting all these resources and time going after people for pruning their own trees? This is the insanity of busybody government. Priorities are set by the whims and agendas of bureaucrats, not by the needs of the people they're supposed to be serving. If being fined for pruning trees isn't bad enough for you, what about being arrested for silently dancing? I know it sounds like the plot from the movie Footloose, but it actually happened this past week in Washington, D.C., when protesters at the Jefferson Memorial started silently dancing to themselves in protest of a recent court ruling. It all started on April 12th, just before midnight, when a group of people decided to celebrate the birthday of Thomas Jefferson, which was the 13th, by silently dancing. Despite the fact that they have a First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, officers demanded that they disperse. Officers decided not to press charges, but one of the people celebrating decided to file a lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. The court ruled that dancing was equivalent to a demonstration, which is prohibited without a permit. Of course, demonstrations are protected by the First Amendment too. You do not need the permission of government bureaucrats to exercise your basic human rights. So in protest, a group of people arranged an event on Facebook to meet at the Jefferson Memorial on the 28th. There, they would dance quietly to themselves without causing any disturbance. The police were ready for them. They grabbed, threw to the ground, choked, and in one case even body slammed these peaceful protesters. The entire altercation was caught on video.
Give you your warnings. If you come out here and you demonstrate by dancing, you will be placed under arrest.
The first arrest appears to have been a couple who were simply hugging each other and swaying.
We're moving, man. We're in
just
love.
touching each other. Sorry, we're stopping. We're stopping. What are you doing? We're stopping. You are not arresting us for standing
For
here.
what? You didn't even give me a warning.
I didn't give you a warning.
Give me a warning. If you would have said something, I would have stopped.
I don't understand. I came over. I didn't even hear. I didn't even hear.
More arrests ensued. The officers really began crossing the line when they ordered one of the protesters to stop and place his hands behind his back, and he complied.
Sir, turn around, put your hands behind your back.
Despite the fact that he did so, that he was in complete compliance with the officer's orders, he was wrestled to the ground.
Watch my order!
One protester was even body slammed even though he was not resisting.
Sir, this is your last warning.
What is going on here?
Police Sergeant David Schlosser said that the actions of the officers are being investigated. Here's the thing. Over and over again, both in the previous instance and in this new one, the police say that this is illegal because one must have a permit to demonstrate at the Jefferson Memorial, and those arrested were charged with protesting without a permit. But here's what the Code of Federal Regulations says on the matter, quote, "No permits may be issued authorizing demonstrations or special events in the following park areas." And included in that is, quote, "The Jefferson Memorial, which means the circular portion of the Jefferson Memorial enclosed by the outermost series of columns, and all portions on the same levels or above the base of these columns, except for the official annual commemorative Jefferson birthday ceremony." In other words, if you want to protest, demonstrate, or dance, you need to get a permit. But you can't get a permit because federal regulations don't allow it. Have these guys ever read the book Catch-22? There's no way around it. This is a blatant violation of the First Amendment. It's also a disgrace to the memory of Jefferson himself. Inscribed all around the Jefferson Memorial is the quote, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Maybe next time these government goons might try looking up at these words before they go arresting people who are not causing any harm to anyone else. The proponents of big government tell people who point out these incredibly stupid things that if you don't like it, move. But really, where can you move to? If you don't want to live in a country that arrests you for dancing, where will you go? Maybe to a country where they arrest you for not doing the impossible? A country like, say, Italy? 7 Italian scientists and technicians with the National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology, including their president, have been arrested and charged with manslaughter because, get this, they didn't predict the 2009 earthquake. Of course, no one can predict earthquakes. If such a thing is even physically possible, it's beyond our current technology to do it. No one in history has ever successfully predicted a major earthquake. These 7 experts were placed under investigation last year, prompting the American Association for the Advancement of Science to complain to Italian authorities and set them straight on the science, apparently to no avail. According to Judge Giuseppe Romano Gagarella, these experts, quote, "thwarted the activities designed to protect the public." Which is ridiculous because, despite the fact that no one can predict exactly when a major earthquake will take place, the Institute did say there were indications a large quake was coming. Of course, another thing that scientists are completely unable to predict is when lunatics in government are going to completely lose their minds. This attitude harkens back to the Middle Ages, when court astrologers were executed if there was a disaster. But unlike astrologers, no one at the Institute even claimed to be able to predict the future. What's next? Witch hunts? The sad thing is, this isn't unique. It's just a more ridiculous manifestation of a dangerous trend with government, the incentive for bureaucrats to avoid recriminations for not avoiding danger by predicting it everywhere. For example, the FDA denies lots of drugs for entering the market because of a risk of death, without comparing it to the number of lives that would likely be saved if the drug were approved. As long as we keep asking the government to be our knight in shining armor and protect us from everything from earthquakes to fatty foods, this kind of thing will always be going on. And now it's time to cook the brains of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. Last week we covered the Bogosity about the fear-mongering around cell phones causing brain cancer. Not to be outdone by the Council of Europe, the World Health Organization has now weighed in on the issue. One would hope they would have injected real science and rationality into the issue. They didn't. They took the fear-mongering and ran with it. They have now classed cell phone radiation, which is just low-power radio waves, remember, as a carcinogenic hazard in Group 2B, the same category as lead, car exhaust, and chloroform. And they said something else as well. Remember last week when Sanjay Gupta tried to subtly imply that cell phone radiation was like a microwave oven? Well, these guys came right out and said it. Dr. Keith Black, chairman of neurology at Cedars-Sinai, said, "What microwave radiation does in most simplistic terms is similar to what happens to food in microwaves, essentially cooking the brain. So in addition to leading to a development of cancer and tumors, there could be a whole host of other effects like cognitive memory function, since the memory temporal lobes are where we hold our cell phones." Come Come on! If cell phones did anything even remotely like cooking your brain, they'd at least make your ear warm first. Again, cell phones just aren't powerful enough to do it. The press release talks about results that are subtle and difficult to detect. But cooking isn't subtle. And it's not like the experiments haven't been done. Put a petri dish full of human cells on top of an active cell phone and leave it there as long as you want. The cells will not be cooked. Black also bleated the cry to protect the children. Children's skulls and scalps are thinner, so the radiation can penetrate deeper into the brain of children and young adults. Their cells are dividing at a faster rate, so the impact of radiation can be much larger. So wait, bones attenuate radio waves? If that's the case, then why do we need to use X-rays, potentially dangerous ionizing radiation, to image bones? If Black is correct, shouldn't we be able to construct such a machine using cell phone radiation instead of X-rays? Such a machine would be safer and use less power. If there were any truth to Black's Bogosity, this would have been done a long time ago. Of course, Sanjay Gupta applauded the report, but the less said about him, the better. The report, or should I say bogus press release designed to get attention, reported its results thusly. The evidence was reviewed critically and overall evaluated as being limited among users of wireless telephones for glioma and acoustic neuroma, and inadequate to draw conclusions for other types of cancers. The evidence from the occupational and environmental exposures mentioned above was similarly judged inadequate. The working group did not quantitate the risk. However, one study of past cell phone use showed a 40% increased risk for gliomas in the highest category of heavy users, and then concluded, the evidence, while still accumulating, is strong enough to support a conclusion and the 2B classification. So wait, they admit the evidence is limited for 2 cancers and inadequate for the rest, and they consider one study, one outlier, as the justification for their entire set of conclusions? This one study, by the way, is the Interphone study published last year. It is this study that found the 40% increase in glioma among heavy cell phone users, but that study itself doubted that this was evidence of a link between cancer and cell phone use. It concluded, overall, no increase in risk of glioma or meningioma was observed with the use of mobile phones. There were suggestions of an increased risk of glioma and much less so meningioma at the highest exposure levels. However, biases and errors limit the strength of the conclusions we can draw from these analyses and prevent a causal interpretation. So we're back to the evidence for cell phones causing cancer to being diddly minus squat, and the evidence against it being everything we know about physics, biology, and radiation. What else could the WHO have possibly done in order to become this week's biggest bogon emitter? And now it's time to sharpen our claws on this week's Idiot Extraordinare! Senator Rand Paul is the son of Congressman Ron Paul and was elected to the U.S. Senate last year as a popular candidate of the grassroots movement known as the Tea Party. Unlike other politicians, he's in favor of our precious liberties and is a principled libertarian. Or is he? Here's Rand Paul being interviewed by talk radio host and conservative blowhard Sean Hannity.
I'm not for profiling people on the color of their skin or on their religion, but I would take into account where they've been traveling, and perhaps you might have to indirectly take into account whether or not they've been going to radical political speeches by religious leaders, but it wouldn't be that they are Islamic. But if someone is attending speeches from someone who is promoting the violent overthrow of our government, that's really an offense that we should be going after. They should be deported or put in prison.
Deported or put in prison for attending a speech? Does he need one of those pocket constitutions to carry around with him so he can be reminded of what the First Amendment says? The content of the speech does not matter. You can't even go after the person giving the speech, no matter how subversive, unless in doing so, he commits actions that represent a clear and present danger. That's what the Supreme Court has said. In Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969, the Supreme Court ruled, the constitutional guarantees of free speech and free press do not permit a state to forbid or prescribe advocacy of the use of force or of law violation except where such advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. So the lawless action not only must be likely to happen, but imminent as well. Otherwise, they're protected.
if let's say we have 100,000 exchange students from the Middle East, I want to know where they are, how long they've been here, whether they've overstayed their welcome, whether they're in school.
Wait, just for being exchange students? Even if they've committed no crimes and haven't acted suspiciously in any way? You want to destroy their privacy and their civil liberties based solely on where they were born? In what way is this even moral, much less constitutional? There is all the difference in the world between defending the country and trampling civil liberties to do it. Not only are the two ideas completely independent of each other, going against civil liberties can actually hinder the defense of our country. Being in favor of protecting civil liberties does not mean that someone wants to coddle the terrorists or sacrifice defense, and as long as that's the case, there is no justification whatsoever for abridging any of our freedoms. Actually, a senator recently made this very same argument. Rather well, in fact. That senator was Rand Paul. In the same interview.
The attacks on the Senate floor were that if I believe that we should have a Fourth Amendment protection and have a judge sign a warrant, that somehow I'm in favor of terrorists having guns, I think is really sort of an obnoxious kind of insult. And I liken it to this. If I believe that a judge should get a warrant before they go into a house of an alleged murderer, does that mean I support murderers? You know, I mean, it's not very logical to argue that way.
How messed up in the head do you have to be in order to be that inconsistent and still make both statements with the same confidence and fervor? Certainly messed up enough to be this week's Idiot Extraordinare. Well, that wraps up this botanic edition of the Bogosity podcast. Please visit the forums at Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and participate in discussions about these subjects and anything else you like. And if you'd like to participate in the Bogosity podcast, you can send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@Bogosity.tv. If you put it in an MP3 file, it just might get played in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from H.L. Mencken. There is always a well-known solution to every human problem. Neat, plausible, and wrong. The Bogosity podcast is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported license.